So what do we do when life gets tough? What do we do when life hurts? Well, we have another number of options at that point. We could become angry, bitter, depressed, hurt. We could run away. We could ignore things, hoping things are going to get better. None of those are really good options. So what do we do when life hurts? Well, that's what the book of Habakkuk is all about. Habakkuk was living in some very depressing, hurtful times in the life of Judah, the southern kingdom. At the time that the book of Habakkuk was written, more than likely, the Babylonian army was just about to overtake the southern kingdom of Judah and carry the people into captivity for 70 years. Habakkuk had seen a lot of bloodshed in his lifetime. He had seen a lot of wars. He had seen a lot of good people die. And because of that, he had a lot of questions for God. He wanted to know why things were the way they were. Just as we do. We have many questions for God sometimes. So what do we do when life hurts? Well, we can look at the message of Habakkuk the prophet to help us discover some answers. First of all, we have to remember that life is not always good. Now that sounds like a simple statement, but sometimes we forget that. Life is not always good. In verse 17, Habakkuk says, though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls. Boy, do you see the bleak picture that Habakkuk is painting here? There's no fruit on the vines, there's no food in the field, there's no livestock in the stall. These were dark, dark times in the life of Habakkuk the prophet. Life is not always fair. Life is going to hurt. Life is full of dark times. And like Habakkuk the prophet, we have a lot of questions for God. We have some things that we want an answer to. In fact, Habakkuk began his book with a question. He began in chapter 1, how long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, but you do not save. Habakkuk had some serious questions for God, and like us, there is just so much about life that we do not understand. Life is too often hurtful. It seems as if there is no hope. So what do we do in those dark times? Well, in those dark times, we have to remember God's purpose for our life. What is God's purpose for our life? When times get tough, a lot of people love to quote Romans 8:28, where we know that all things work together for the good of those that love God and are called according to His purpose. Oh, that's very true. Absolutely true. 100% true. But the very next verse, verse 29, gives us the purpose for God in our lives. It says, for those God foreknew, He also predestined to become conformed to the image of His Son. You see, God's purpose for your life is to conform you to the image of His Son, to make you like Christ. And God is going to do that by any means necessary. And sometimes that means we have to go through the dark times of life. That means we have to go through the hurtful times. That's where we learn. That's where we gain experience. We don't learn in the good times. We learn in the bad times. And we have to remember that God is always good and He has a purpose even in the hurts of our life. We also have to remember, as Habakkuk the prophet did, that life may not be good, but God is. Habakkuk began verse 17 with the word though. Though the fig tree would not blossom, though there's no food in the field, though there's no cattle in the stall, that's the reality of things. Times were dark. That's the reality. Now look at verse 18. Yet I will exalt in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Wow. Sometimes trusting God is a matter of the will. We have to make a conscious effort to trust God because it's not easy to trust God at all times. But we have to do as Habakkuk did and say, yeah, the reality is life hurts. Things are tough. Things aren't going good. But I will trust in God. It's so easy to trust in the good times. But what happens? What happens when the doctor comes in and says, I'm sorry, it's cancer? What happens when your life falls apart? What happens when you have more bills than you have money? What happens when someone you love very dearly passes from this life? What happens then? You have to make a choice to trust in God. What happens when we trust in God? We'll look at verse 19. Habakkuk says, the Lord God is my strength, and He has made my feet like hinds' feet, and He makes me walk on high places. Habakkuk discovered that when he trusted in God, he found that God was his strength. You may have a lot of questions in life, and you don't have the answers, but you can go to the one who does have the answers. We must discover that as Habakkuk did, that God has the answer to life. He is the answer. We must choose to trust in God in all situations of life, because God is our strength, and He is the only one. He is the only one who can deliver us from the trouble we're in. Habakkuk began his book with a question, but he ended it with an exclamation mark. Habakkuk began by trying to tell God how he should do things and how he should run things. But he ended his book by discovering that God is in control of all things, and we must do the same. We must discover, as Habakkuk the prophet did, that God is in control, that God is the one that can deliver us, that God is our strength,